Rolling Stone magazine has called Daniel Lanois, quote, the most important record producer to emerge in the 80s. He's produced groundbreaking albums for U2, Bob Dylan, Peter Gabriel, Emmylou Harris, and many others. He's won several Grammys and Juno Awards. And this week, Daniel will be inducted into the Canadian Music Industry Hall of Fame. But first, it's my pleasure to welcome Daniel Lanois to Radio 2 Drive. Thanks for coming into the studio.
Yes, you're very welcome. It's always good to be here in your starlit room.
Yeah. It's beautiful.
You could never be in a bad mood in this room.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's the whole idea. So in the run up to this great recognition that's coming your way, we've asked you to pick some albums that you've produced throughout your career, and so every day we're going to discuss one of those throughout the week here. Your first pick is Apollo, Atmospheres and Soundtracks. That's a record that was released in 1983, and I think this was the second record you worked on with Brian Eno, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Second or third.
Yeah.
It was sort of the ambient chapter of my life where I worked with Eno in Hamilton, Ontario. We knocked out I think 5 or 6 ambient albums.
Right. And so going back to 82, 83, this would have been close to the beginning. I'm thinking of your relationship with Brian Eno. When did you first meet him?
I met Brian in '79, and we went to work in Ireland with U2. I think Unforgettable Fire came out in '84.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah. So thinking back to the early '80s and those initial encounters, what do you remember about your first impression of Brian Eno?
My first impression was that I didn't know him and I wouldn't fully trust him yet.
Right.
And I said to my brother, who was taking care of the business upstairs at the studio in Hamilton, I said, make sure that this guy turns up with cash because,
right.
we don't not do a bunch of work and not get paid.
Right.
That was the... But he had requested one particular keyboard, a great keyboard, a Yamaha keyboard, the first polyphonic synthesizer called the CS80.
Huh.
And this turned out to be a real essential part of our work together. So it was very much a jump-off point for me sonically to get to work with one of the great masters. And I'm sorry I was a little suspicious of his appearance at first.
Right. So how long after that initial meeting did you begin to sense that this working relationship you had with him might grow into one of the most commercially successful production teams of your time? Did you have a sense you were on to something early on?
I knew we were on to something in terms of commitment. That all came from Brian. I mean, I had my skills down pretty good, and, we had obviously built something great. That little studio in Hamilton was a real peach. It was a nice place to waltz into if you were a creator, as Brian is. And quite quickly, I think he picked up on the fact that I was not only technical but musical. Now, Brian came up through the ranks of art schools, and he was very much a very school gentleman. I never went to school.
Right.
So while he was in school studying art, I was in the laboratory refining my skills with recording equipment and so on. So it was an interesting marriage because I was able to provide him with musical suggestions that were mysterious to him, but it sped the process along, and he realized that I was a good partner to work with.
Yeah, right. And so now, of course, you've been working together for a very long time. Do you think with what you just mentioned, the idea of being able to show each other ideas that maybe you hadn't thought of on your own is the key to the success that you two have had working together for such a long time?
We always come up with something quick. We don't have to have a lot of verbal exchange to get started on a morning. We just plug in, and he's got some sounds, I've got sounds, and in a matter of 20 minutes, half an hour, there's something pouring out of the speakers that speaks for us. So if we just have a coffee and shut up and get on with some work,
right.
What comes out of the speakers is pretty much the statement of the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And it always kind of stayed that way. We're both early risers, show up early, get something going. so that by noon you've got something to talk about, whether it's just Eno and myself in the studio, or maybe the band's coming in at 1 o'clock.
Right.
Then we brought something to the table, and we have some sonics for people to hear.
Huh. You've said that, this is another quote, sometimes we have preconceptions about what we need to be able to operate, but limitations can be your friend as well. And so thinking back again to those early days and working up a lot of the ambient sound that you were working on in those days, were there limitations that helped you create the sound that the two of you together pioneered?
Yes, there were limitations. I didn't have a lot of effects. I only had 3 effects, but they were good ones, and I knew them very well. I got to understand all the idiosyncratic details of those boxes, and so I was a master of a few things, which is probably a good life lesson, I mastered a few things and not just a dabbler in all.
Right.
And that philosophy still holds true for me today. I've in my studio right here in Toronto, I have a few boxes that just came in, and we're fiddling around with them. There's a little iPad DJ
Right.
program that you get, and you get 2 little turntables, and
Right.
and it has a filter in it. You can loop things, and just last night we were fiddling around with this stuff, and I already found something that was special in there for me. And that's all I need, just one little thing that's special, as long as it's shining and holds a lot of potential, then I can run with that and build a whole song or record out of it.
And so some of the basic tools in working with those limitations is something it seems that you've held on to and just continue to work with through the years. But were there, working on this album in particular, this Eno record, do you remember, were there discoveries, new things that you learned in the studio back in 1983 when you were working on this record with him?
We had a specific task at hand. It was about to be very celestial, much like this room,
Right.
starlit. It was about to be starlit because we were providing music to a documentary on the Apollo space missions. That's what we were meant to be doing there in the studio. So it was, and that's a great idea for anybody, to be writing music for something other than yourself.
Right.
Even if it doesn't turn out to be used for that, I think it's a nice sort of bluff that to operate by. So it was about to be celestial, and we hit on some sounds very early on that provided that. Eno had this cheap little, almost like toy keyboard thing called the Suzuki Omnichord, and
Right. Yeah.
we recorded that and slowed it down and put it through a bunch of amps, and it went from being this rinky-dink little sound to being something very, very deep and celestial. And also the astronauts involved in those space missions, some of them were from Texas, so they wanted their country music up there.
Huh.
So we thought, let's put a little country twang into this. And lucky for me, I had my pedal steel guitar. And I said, Brian, well, would you like to hear the steel guitar? He said, sure. And I played it, and it fit perfectly. In fact, there's a track on there called Deep Blue Day that I think is well represents everything I just talked about. Very
Right.
celestial with steel guitar.
It seems to me one of the Twitter questions that came in from our audience that we'll get to later, someone had a question specific about that song.
Okay, good.
That I'll ask you about again later on. But it's interesting what you just mentioned, that going into the studio and working on this record, that you had an idea that was bigger than just the two of you in the room, something bigger. You were thinking about the cosmos and something celestial that kind of offered maybe a bit of a guiding light and helped, create just sort of some idea to pursue going in. And you mentioned that was helpful. So did you take an idea like that from that experience and use the same idea after, even if it wasn't there, to come up with some sort of concept to anchor your imagination in when pursuing the vision of a record? Do you know what I mean? Does it help to kind of have to be thinking bigger than just a couple guys in a room like that?
It helps to philosophize and hang out with your friends and talk about life and see what's important to you musically. And the nice thing about working with a buddy or working with a group, you have a built-in filtering mechanism. There are a lot of things you're not going to do,
Right.
and there's a few things you definitely want to do.
Right.
And so the having some buddies around, you're constantly reminded about where you're going to go, stylistically or philosophically or musically, where you're going to go. And so I certainly had that with Eno.
Yeah.
It's a nice thing even to this day to have.
Sure. Right. Yeah. And you mentioned that, and I didn't know this before, that that the idea going into the studio to work on this record was for the documentary, for all things space and so on and so forth. And what struck me as interesting about that is that although this record was released in 1983, it's had a life that's gone on and on since then for film in particular, because it seems to me music from this record's been used in films like 28 Days Later, Traffic, Train Spotting. So what do you think it is about a record that was recorded the better part of 30 years ago that's still working and still resonating for people and finding life in films like that?
Yeah, there's a beautiful piece of music on there called Unending Ascent, and it keeps getting licensed in films for film. I think we could safely assume that when something is made out of pure love, then it will always resonate somehow. We weren't driven by any kind of industry expectations other than supplying music for a beautiful film. So we weren't thinking about, how could we get in the charts, or what will the record company think of this? And so there was none of that hanging over our heads. And I think when something is made in a pure way, with a lot of love, then it will stand the test of time.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Daniel Lanois, one of the most successful and creative record producers of all time, has been my guest here in the studio. When he's not producing career-defining albums for the likes of U2, Bob Dylan, Peter Gabriel, and, well, a very long list of musicians, he's an artist in his own right with a great catalog of acclaimed records. And this week, Daniel Lanois will be inducted into the Canadian Music Industry Hall of Fame, and we'll have a chance to reflect on a different Lanois-produced album every day this week. We'll be back here in the studio tomorrow to talk about an Irish band that Brian Eno introduced him to called U2. And we'll look forward to that. Thanks a lot.
All right. You're very welcome.